For those of you who haven't heard, Superman, as of recent, has been going under changes, and the major one that everyone's been talking about is, of course, his sexuality. Now he's gone from being straight to bisexual, or technically it's a new character, who cares? Because in this case, I'm not talking about that change. Rather, I'm talking about a change which is almost more pernicious and subversive. In this case, we are talking about the change of Superman's motto from Truth, Justice, and the American Way, which has been his motto for 80 plus years, into the motto of Truth, Justice, and a Better Tomorrow, which, considering the sort of writers they get for Superman comics at this point, probably just means communism. Now, this is something which would have been unthinkable to happen in Superman just a couple years ago, and something so unthinkable, in fact, that when someone actually suggested this would eventually happen, they were decried as someone promoting a fallacy, particularly a slippery slope fallacy, and in that case, the person who was floating around the idea was Dean Cain. He said that, well, it seems to me, with how they're going with Superman, that they're eventually going to change the motto, and only to later have the Twitter users freak out and say, no, this isn't going to happen. It was used this year, according to one of the writers on the current run of the comic at the time. This particular incident is fairly illustrative of one of the major problems in online debate, and that is fallacies. Because, just in case you haven't noticed, fallacies have utterly sublimated all of internet debate. You can't go 5 adjacent minutes of watching any online debater, particularly one with Breadtube ties, without hearing them make some sort of a reference to some other person making a fallacy of one of the sorts, whether it be an ad hominem, or a no true Scotsman, or a slippery slope. They will not rest until there is no fallacies to be found whatsoever. And the way that most people do this is equally dishonest, because instead of using their logical capabilities to actually discern whether what someone is doing is a fallacy or not, instead they take anything which looks vaguely like a fallacy and claim it is, and trying to make their arguments around the idea that it is. And this leads to a subset of the internet debate, which is the anti-argument, or at least what I like to call the anti-argument. Because in a lot of cases, in order to make the argument against fallacies, they will run up against things that they think are fallacies, and because of their midwit brains, they assume must be fallacies, but aren't actually fallacies, and are logically consistent. And how could that be, you might ask? Well, fallacies are supposed to be replications of good arguments. If they weren't, then they wouldn't be effective in the first place. So of course, they're going to look fairly similar to good arguments if they're done well, and in many cases, they are. And so what ends up happening in these cases is that they will simply go on to make arguments against the very foundation of discussion, debate, and the very fabric of reality. And this goes especially well with the slippery slope fallacy, because what you'll see in many examples of people claiming a slippery slope fallacy is they will say that the other person is making a fallacy because they're saying that logical progressions exist, which fundamentally is just an argument against cause and effect. Essentially what many of these people will end up saying, though incidentally in many cases and accidentally, is that if you are claiming that one thing can lead to another thing in a progression of time, that your argument is thus illegitimate. When in reality, what an actual slippery slope fallacy is when the logical progression does not actually, in fact, exist. It's when you're making the argument that I take a step forward and then a cliff will magically appear and I'll drop right off of it. When in fact, right next to me, there is no cliff. There is simply more flat ground. But the counter also is the case, because if I make the argument that if you're standing on top of a cliff and then you step off of it, that you'll then fall to the ground, that is not a slippery slope fallacy, because the logical correlation and the logical progression actually does exist, and it did exist for the Dean Cain example. And this isn't the only example in fallacies where this sort of thing will come about. This also happens when talking about no true Scotsman fallacies. In case you've never heard it, many people will say that if you try to categorize people at all, if you try to say, for example, that Christians are generally going to be against adultery, or they're going to be against X, Y, or Z. You know, they're going to be for and against the normal Christian positions. There will be people who will unironically state that because you are trying to categorize Christianity as being something which exists and actually has meaning, that you are thus doing a no true Scotsman. And really, in the case of no true Scotsman, it's even worse than the slippery slope example, because with no true Scotsman, the very name of the fallacy itself is, in some sense, an anti-argument, because what happens there is that the nominal use of no true Scotsman and the textbook example is that no true Scotsman wouldn't drink themselves black drunk, or something to that effect. No true Scotsman wouldn't do typically Scottish thing. And in that case, it's not actually a fallacy. It's not actually a false categorization necessarily, because you're not claiming they're not a Scotsman, period. Certainly they are meet the bare minimum requirements of being a Scotsman. Certainly they've been born and raised in Scotland and are born to Irish descent, or Scottish descent, sorry. I get those two mixed up on occasion. But instead, you're trying to categorize what a true Scotsman is. And true, in this instance, meaning pure, or nominal, or normal, or quintessential. You know, essentially the cream of the crop of what a Scotsman is. And in that case, the cream of the crop of the Scotsman would be the stereotypical Scotsman. It would be the Scotsman who embodies all of the cultural values of Scotland. So even then, in the name of it, it's not even necessarily a fallacy. That's how bad the anti-argument phenomenon has gotten. In this case, it's an anti-categorization argument, because if you even try to categorize things, period, you can run afoul of the no true Scotsman fallacy. And this goes in many, 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 many cases. And not only with these two. You can find basically any fallacy in existence, and there will be a requisite anti-argument to follow it right behind for midwits who don't understand what fallacies actually are. And this isn't even limited to fallacies. You'll also see people use these sorts of arguments without necessarily resorting to claiming the other person is making a fallacy. The most quintessential example of this is the anti-morality argument. Essentially, if you say that people should act better in situations, then you're making a bad argument. And you might say this is absurd, but this is true, and it's something that happened in a Kyle Rittenhouse debate, of all things, between Vosh and Destiny, which I have linked down in the description with a timestamp. And I suggest you go check that out, because it is simply baffling how much Vosh gets away with in this clip, essentially claiming that if you're trying to make a moral system, that you thus must take into account that people are going to do things and base it around that. Essentially saying that we should be basing our moral systems around the idea that we shouldn't be telling people what to do, which is exactly what morality exists to do. It exists to show people what to do and how to do things and how to live life. That's the point. That's why it's called prescriptive. And the funny thing is that, of course, Vosh doesn't actually believe this. In this very debate, he's making the argument that Kyle Rittenhouse should act better and lay down his gun and submit himself to the mob, which, you know, absurd argument aside, is still an actual moral system, and something which runs afoul of that very argument, which represents one of the major maladies of anti-arguments themselves, because most of the people who are using anti-arguments are not doing it consistently. Because when they're making categorizations, or when they're explaining logical progressions, or when they are trying to tell people to act better, they won't use the anti-argument, and they will simply remove it from their entire cognizance. They will not recognize that they are being contradictory inherently with these arguments. And this is incredibly pervasive. It happens all the time with online debates, and frankly, is the reason why I don't watch them anymore. It's just gotten boring, especially since you can't get any real arguments in at all, because every single one will simply be claimed to be a fallacy of one sort or another. There are so many of them, and it's so pervasive that I just can't involve myself with that sort of thing. And that's why I don't on most occasions. Even this is sort of going out of my comfort zone, since I'm not even talking about normal news. But I felt like I had to do it because I hate this sort of thing. And I think that's where I'm going to leave you guys off. If you enjoyed that video, do in fact subscribe down below, and check me out on other platforms. I'm on BitChute, I'm on Brighteon, I'm on Rumble, and I'm on Odyssey. I'm also on Minds, Gab, and Getter. If you want to check me out there, you can check out all those links down in the description. I really suggest you do. Alt Tech is great. I'm KelKidman. This has been Breaking on the Daily, and I'm out.